when I saw on the agenda that we were following Mike Berners-Lee, I thought, eek. But actually, I think he's teed us up really well for this slot because he's really showed us that we're staring something quite dramatic in the face here. And whatever happens, we're going to have to do a lot of climate risk management, even in best case scenarios. So it's a pleasure to be chairing a panel today with this exciting range of speakers. This is a topic, I think it's a really exciting emergent topic. It's early in the day, so there's a lot of kind of creative opportunity with it still. We're going to try and make it as non-scary as possible. The audio is not great, is it? We were advised to make it positive. It's kind of a bit difficult with this one, but let's be as solution-focused as possible.
Shall I go?
And just a quick note as well on the Slido, if we're really keen to get your thoughts on this, so if people would like to pose any challenge, question, comment, anything you like, then you can do so on the Slido and we'll pick it all up after, because we can't do live Q&A, sadly. I'd like to start off with a few provocations, well, two actually, for you all to ponder, and the panellists too, which the first is, I believe that the risk angle is actually a better in for digital sustainability, especially with our digital leadership, than digital sustainability in terms of environmental impact reduction. So, you know, are people feeling that? It feels like a now problem. It feels like resiliency is a core part of digitisation and something that we can neatly dovetail into. So that's number one. The second is, yes, there's a big resilience overlap with energy and material efficiency. If we need less stuff, which is what most people are talking about today, that's less supply chain reliance, bringing some level of resilience. But beyond that, I think there might be some tensions at play here. So I'm hoping that's something that we can get into a bit. And I'm not sure whether this principle in the strategy plays nicely with all of the other elements in the strategy as well. So maybe that's something we can dig into. But I'm just, as a practitioner on this topic area, I'm going to take Chair's prerogative just to give it, like, I'll try and keep it to a few minutes, but just a quick explainer, because this is quite new to a lot of people. So a quick 101, apologies for all my notes, but so we're already at 1.5 degrees and accelerating faster than a lot of the models show, risks baked in here. In terms of digital risk, we've got things like flood, heat wave, storm, subsidence, supply chain issues and things like that. Government colleagues, you will have had people who've worked with you on Mighty Oak, which was preparing the UK for power outages. So that's a great entry point for this topic area. It affects a lot of stuff, power outages, but it's an existential risk for digital. So I suggest that as a starting point. And then this is 10 years old now, but Emma Fryer, when she was at Tech UK, wrote the second round ARP report. And it's a great summary of how direct climate risk shows up in the digital tech stack, along with the UK climate risk sector summaries. So that's a bit of homework for you all to do. In terms of my work, which Claire Robinson from Transform is featuring in a big way now as well, who's on the front row, we're looking at a systems modelling approach to this topic area. So this started back in the 40-degree heat wave back in summer 2022. There's an amazing resource online, the guys in St Thomas's outage that they had there at the hospital. It was a big lessons learned, warts and all report about what went wrong from a hardware infrastructure people perspective that caused months and months of operations to get cancelled after the heat wave melted the servers, metaphorically speaking. But that's a simple problem, like the much cited putting servers in the basement if you're in a flood zone kind of example here. Actually, the digital infrastructure that we rely on is so much more of a big system, and I think more akin to like the food supply chain or something like that. But we're all working together to try and create this binary outcome of the digital working or not working. But if it does break, it has a huge knock-on effect on the rest of the economy. So how do we start to map that out is the work that we've been doing. And there's a white paper that Claire and I put together, which I'll happily point people towards after the event. We're next focusing the model after learning around things like the need to geographically spread your hosting providers. If you're in cloud, you might have hidden vulnerabilities because everything's in the same floodplain, or the real power of procurement, because so much of the levers here are in that space. But we're moving this towards localising the model for Somerset to try and create them some really useful insights into how to prioritise their digital resilience action planning. And the last thing I just wanted to say was that a big gap in this bit of the agenda is that it's so difficult to create a business case for it. So the Green Book says that we should be factoring in cost contingency or risk mitigations. But how do you do that? How do you find the money for it? It's really important. And yeah, I was right. I wondered who's the sponsor for this one. There isn't a sponsor, and that's because I don't think many people have figured out what the business case is yet from a commercial angle either. So just to finish off, collaboration is one of the themes of the event. This is like a system problem. It's a huge collaborative example, and it's really complicated. So the panel's going to embrace the complexity briefly, and then hopefully zoom back into some practical, tangible stuff at the end. So apologies for taking a bit of time there, but I think it's important to kind of just frame the session. So first question is to Mark, and it's about how we can leverage some of the real momentum that's building in the digital decarbonisation world to start to move some focus and progress in this crucial topic area.
So we'll start with something simple. It's good that there is focus. That's true. But we're still in the world of measuring things with made-up numbers. So we're creating reports that no one cares about. So they're sitting on the shelves, a number gets created, and everyone nods wisely. That's a huge problem. And it kind of comes to one of my biggest points with this is I absolutely agree we have to build this into risk. Because the reality is sustainability standing on its own, no one cares about at leadership. It just sits on, and yes, there are exceptions, some broad sweeping statement, but generally, people just don't care about it. It sits there in isolation and people frown and they say wise things, but then they go away and do nothing. We have to tie it into the wider risk conversation. We have to tie it into cost conversations. We have to tie it into every conversation, because if we don't, absolutely nothing happens. But to do that, we need better quality data in the first place. So the whole decarbonisation data needs to be more detailed, more granular, and we need to really address the elephant in the room, which no one's willing to talk about, which is we're wasting more than half of every pound we spend on IT. Whether you like it or not, we're building redundancy that's not needed, resilience in places it's not required, we're oversizing things, overspecifying things. And it's a really harsh comment for a lot of the technology vendors in the room. It's the other elephant, which is everyone wants people to carry on spending more with them. And we can't do that. It's fundamentally flawed. We cannot have that as a principle if everyone is only motivated to be selling more. Everyone wants someone else to spend less, but not with them. So what we need is that better data where we're factoring in actually efficiency of consumption aligned to the decarbonisation data that is aligned to a risk program. So you can then tie everything together and you can actually see the wider impact. Because my personal experience is sustainability programs on their own with decarbonisation data become nice to have things that leaders ask you to do but don't actually do anything with. If you tie it into risk and other frameworks, you actually get far more traction because they actually have to do something with it.
Thank you, Mark. I'm really interested to know if you've got any thoughts on the tensions and synergies between the adaptation and decarbonisation agendas.
Yeah, particularly if it comes to resilience, if you're looking at it through that lens, we build in too much resilience for services that don't need it. There's a singular, and this comes back to my elephant in the room, which is leadership accountability. Leaders have to stop treating this in isolation and they've got to actually step up and take personal accountability for what they're actually spending. They are fundamentally not doing that today. They're ignoring it, they're paying no attention to it. The average sort of very senior leader doesn't have a clue what their wastage levels are in IT. They don't have any metrics, any data or anything. And we have this one-size-fits-all approach. So we do things like resilience, go, well, it must have disaster recovery. You know, why? If there's a disaster, who cares if the room booking system doesn't come back? No one. It's irrelevant. We should be funneling the resources into where they're actually required. We should be treating critical systems like they are critical systems and everything else like it's a nice to have and can come back eventually. And we should be sizing it and designing it appropriately and not having situations like we have today. So I can give an example of a very large cloud environment which has an average CPU utilization of 12%. And that's just nuts. We're wasting 88% of the resources, which in this environment, it was over £100 million a year of wasted resources. In an environment where we say we're cash constrained. I don't think we are cash constrained. I think we're just constrained by leadership's desire to get involved in the details and actually take accountability for what it is they're doing.
Thank you. Okay.
I'll go.
So jumping over to Andrew.
Sorry.
So Manogna, who's also on the panel, recently flagged up to me that actually, when you get climate-triggered digital outages, that raises cyber vulnerability because the digital systems are under pressure and the attack surface is bigger. So this has really opened up an interesting avenue for us to kind of try and raise the profile for this by piggybacking on the more mature topic area of cyber. But Andrew, we'd love to kind of understand from your perspective how we can learn and accelerate this climate risk management from the journey that the cyber risk programs have already been on for a good while.
So I think the first thing to Mark's point, I've seen some terrible redundancy built into systems. The 3 firewalls in a row designed that some power stations have had because enough vendors have meant that they want to have, I want to have a view of this, I want to have a view of this, I want to have a view of this. And so you actually create so much more challenge in your digital estate by actually just continuing to try and bundle extra stuff in there because people want to have visibility of it. And this has actually been a challenge that we've been facing looking at the offshore wind sector. So coming back to the point of risk, over the past 6 months, we have done a full risk teardown of an offshore wind farm. Looking through the entirety of the wiring diagrams, the systems, the components, building all the way through to knowing what all of the protocols are doing, how they are potentially vulnerable, what can bring it down. And at the end of it, it sounds terrifying. You know, it actually just genuinely sounds terrifying to go, okay, right, well, we've done this and there's 120 attacks that we could do right now on a wind farm. You know, that's the kind of thing. And that's in the latest technology. That's the stuff that we're building that we say is going to be resilient, the stuff that we say is going to be good and useful and ideally secure for 30 plus years. And this is one of the things that we've seen a lot across the history of our critical national infrastructure, is the fact that we've been looking at things that are put into place 40 years ago that are still active today, that have components in every single decade since then that are all meant to work together. And so there's not this unified picture of what it means to work with that. And that is really a big challenge for us, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to say, we want you to be secure. We want you to be as secure as possible. But that system over there, that really critical part, is running Windows XP. Something that hasn't been in support for 15 years. And we start asking these questions, we start asking these requirements, and it is really, really challenging. And just looking to the sessions earlier today, so many of the things that came up around kind of what you've got to do at the end of the life of a product, or all of these things, I was just going, yep, that's security's had that challenge, security's had that challenge. We are still working on solutions for it. We're still not there with it. But the one thing that I kind of, just to finish off, want to discuss is that motivation, those incentives, because we still go in constantly to talk to people about security, and they can't seem to put aside even a fraction of a percent for security. And I have a feeling that sustainability is also suffering from that exact same challenge of people going, here's £1 billion project, can we have 100,000 for security or sustainability? And someone just goes, no.
Thank you. Do you have any thoughts on how we could potentially link up cyber and climate risk to think about them more holistically, or are there any frameworks or methodologies out there that we could dovetail into for stress testing or anything like that?
Yeah, so one thing that we've been working on ourselves recently is, through DCIT and others, the discussion around secure by design has been a big idea, looking at building in security principles from the get-go, trying to make sure that there's this idea of security throughout the lifespan. We've just started some research on green by design. So this is actually taking it a step further. So taking the secure by design principles and actually looking at sustainability alongside those principles. Because one of the things, again, we're saying, if we're expecting people to use devices longer and have, have something in place for not just 2 or 3 years before it gets replaced, but 5, 10 years. We want to make sure it's designed well, but we want to also make sure it's designed with that sustainability angle in place so that we're not, again, at the end of it going, it's like, well, we managed to do security okay, but we traded off sustainability as a result of that.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. By the way, panelists, if you want to respond to any of people's comments, do jump in.
Please yell at me.
Yeah. Okay. Go on. No? Okay. So moving on to Manoj now. So just layering up the complexity a bit. So we've thought about climate risk, we've thought about how that interfaces with cyber risk, but starting to build in how that affects the digital services which are so ubiquitous now that we totally rely on in society. So Manoj, I know you've been doing a lot of work recently looking at the nexus of climate, digital and cyber risk. So would you be able to tell us a bit about that, please?
Definitely. Before I go into that, I'll connect with what Andrew talked about in terms of let going of sustainability for security. And I think that's exactly where the nexus really plays a really big role. But if I take a step back and we think about climate risks, a majority of us probably here think about how climate risks impacts us, and we think about it from our people perspective, our health. It's too hot, I don't feel well, respiratory illnesses, air quality, etc. If we think about it from the perspective of our assets, we think about our cars, our homes, smart technology. If we go a step further, like physical infrastructure, we think about transport links, we think about the infrastructure that we use on a daily basis, roads, bridges, can we access them in a climate event? But one of the key things, especially given the pace at which we are trying to digitalize government services, is that a majority of what we link climate risks with, whether it's from a people perspective, a asset perspective, and or a physical infrastructure perspective, is becoming heavily digitalized, and it's becoming heavily dependent on digital infrastructure. And so when we think about physical climate risks, there's that very important impact on what essentially is that central nervous system of everything that we use in our lives to power and use our modern facilities, which is essentially digital infrastructure and ICT. From that perspective, we're on a path to heavily digitalize. However, on the flip side, we also know that, for example, digital public infrastructure is already categorized as one of the most vulnerable from climate events, especially when we think about the compounding impacts that they will face. And when we think about compounding impacts as well, it's exactly to that systemic impact of climate risk that we've been discussing within this panel and all the previous panels as well, in terms of how does a trigger event like heat stress or flooding eventually lead to impact on the physical layer of infrastructure. So as we move towards cloud first, digital first, our last mile is still very much rooted in the physical environment, literally and metaphorically. And from that perspective, how does something like flooding or subsidence, or even just a simple movement of the environment actually impact our digital infrastructure? What does that mean in terms of elements like thermal throttling and connectivity issues that essentially then lead to what you have as a severely lagging digital system that probably frontline workers within the NHS, for example, are using, or our security teams are using. And that's essentially arm twisting us into looking at manual workarounds or shadow IT, and essentially triggering then towards increased attack surfaces for cyber vulnerability. So we've got essentially something as what we perceive as simple as increase in temperature, ultimately leading down to a particular critical digital system becoming highly exposed to cyber threats that then cause a lot of human impacts themselves, whether it's threat to operational continuity, or on the flip side as well, if we think about the research that's done in terms of how a cyber incident impacts people in themselves, if we just take the incident responders, I think the metric is around 65% of them have to seek mental health help, primarily because it's extremely stressful. They feel responsible for the attack. When we link that to also, for example, incident fatigue and the number of incidents we'll see increasing as well, there's a direct impact on civil servants doing their job on a day-to-day basis. And what does that mean in terms of also increasing the scope of human error? So it's essentially a vicious cycle that is starting to emerge, where we've got the convergence of climate risk, essentially increasing digital fragility, that then increases cyber risk. And from that perspective, as we digitalize, it's very important for us to keep this convergence in mind, because it has a very clear link also with costs, especially when we think about the link with the electricity consumption and water consumption that will rise as we have volatility, even if we put AI to the side and high performance computing to the side. If we just look at how legacy systems will be volatile and what that means in terms of costing, and now we add the AI layer. So there's essentially a very, very important need for us to be looking at this convergence, and really, to Andrew's point, in sort of decoupling climate risk and digital resilience and cybersecurity, really weaving that in so that we're building our digital estate that's truly fit for the future, not just in 10, 20 years, but in 30, 60, 100 years, as we continue to progress as government as well.
Thank you. Yeah, it's fascinating stuff, isn't it? So, Rachel, much of the topic today is about how do we make the digital itself greener, less environmental impact. But I think, so the focus of, my opening pitch was how do we make the digital resilient to climate change so we can use it as a resilience lever. I know a lot of your work looks at how digital systems interface with other sectors. So could you explore a bit with us about how these digital and other infrastructure sectors lean on each other?
Absolutely. I mean, they're all fundamentally connected. Every sector that I work in relies on digital technology to be able to function just day to day in emergencies. I could go on and on all day about the many ways in which they're connected, but to try to narrow it down a bit, I'm going to talk about how even for these other sectors to be resilient, they often need this digital technology. You gave a great example at the start in the health sector. All the things that we've learned from that 40-degree heat wave and the many ways that we're dependent in ways that we didn't even realize. Where the comments around stress testing is absolutely so important to really recognize where we are. But I mean, just to give a few examples, when we've got extreme weather, which we're already seeing, but predicted to see even more going forward, all of the sectors that I work in rely on digital technology to coordinate that response. So say there's an extreme event and power lines are down, damage to water pipes, so people in some situations don't have access to water. The repair crews that need to go out and fix that rely on ICT to communicate their response. And if that is taken out in the same event, and if we're not prepared for that, that can really hinder our ability to get people connected, including, to your points around the need for prioritization. There are things like the Priority Services Register, which recognize where people may, in particular, need to be connected to these services more quickly, homebound disabilities, home medical equipment that needs to be connected. We have ways of prioritizing that, but in certain situations, servers are taking out things like that, access to information. If you can't even access that list of who your Priority Service Register customers are that you need to get connected quite quickly, all of these things are really key things we need to bear in mind. But even outside of the kind of acute emergency, the longer term response as well, some of the key things, for example, to pick on the water sector, some of the key adaptation measures we have in the water sector to deal with the fact that we're getting increasingly dry, hot summers, increasing drought in the summers, but also increasing rainfall in the winter, flooding. A lot of the response to that is really managed through digital technology. So things like sensors on pipes that can tell you if a pipe has burst or if it's leaking and causing flooding. Again, you're reliant on that digital technology. And if that is not resilient to those same climate hazards that you're trying to prevent causing these impacts, if that is taken out as well, it really hinders your response, especially the more we get dependent on that. Even basic things like having strong mobile data coverage is essential for smart meters, which are one of our key adaptation measures for making sure we're using water more efficiently during increasing drought. So just a very small number of ways in which it's essential, but to try to be positive, as we've said, we want to just not talk about all the problems, but all the solutions. Already mentioned things like stress testing, but also the need to coordinate and understand where these interdependencies are. There's a lot of great work happening in government right now. Some of you might be familiar with the CREDO project, which is bringing together regulators in water, in telecoms, in energy, and the companies delivering these services as well to share their data to better understand, okay, this substation is connected to this mast, is connected to this water treatment plant. So we start to understand where actual critical dependencies are, where we do need that redundancy, where we maybe don't, where something isn't as critical, to really understand that better. Climate Resilient Infrastructure Forum in Scotland is doing similar work. They're bringing together all of the different infrastructure sectors to better map these interdependencies out and identify where those critical weak points are that we need to patch up. I think I'm probably at time there. Like I said, I could go on all day.
I wish we had more time. This could be a whole afternoon session in its own right, I think. But we're getting the short time signals over there. But I'd love to just flip this a bit from the head spinningly complex to some really ultra simple takeaways from the panel. I know it's a bit reductive, but just something that people can take away with them. So I'll just kick off. We'd love you to come and collaborate with us on the next phase of our modelling work. So if this has kind of sparked anyone's interest, then please reach out to me or Claire later on today, and that'd be great.
I'll try and be positive. Yeah. No, so one of the things that I would personally love to see is leadership's pay and remuneration actually tied to the reductions, actually tangibly tied to efficiency of consumption and tied to how efficiently they use every penny we're doing, because that's what drives the reductions.
From my perspective, I think for me, it's entirely around, let's look at climate risk in tangent with strategic business priorities and organizational priorities. What do we want to achieve? Will it be disrupted by climate risk, either from a digital and or a cyber perspective? And how do we effectively weave it through so that we can build business cases by establishing those cost benefits that we can through savings or even risk mitigation or adaptation strategies. And I think my last statement is just do it. Let's just do it.
I would say make sure that climate risk is not only sitting within sustainability, but it is part of your risk register and part of the risk management team within your organization, that it's on their radar, because it's a current and future risk that needs to be dealt with accordingly. But also look carefully at what you depend on and who depends on you. And when you're developing your adaptation plans, deciding where you need to site critical infrastructure and things that you depend on, make sure you're considering those upstream and downstream interdependencies. You may not realize where something really critical is dependent on you, and that just requires open and honest conversations we sometimes struggle to have when we talk about resilience. We try to keep things quite guarded, but the only way you can have that true interconnected resilience is by speaking to each other.
So my message would be to just try and be as proactive as possible. So much that we've seen essentially go wrong in the cyber security world has been as a factor of people just trying to constantly react, not trying to get ahead of what's going on. So the more that you can think about how to get ahead, how to get the ideas into bigger either policy pieces or internal pieces, or align it to other things, just so the conversation is constantly happening. People are constantly thinking about it and then constantly able to act on it. I think that is going to kind of be the bit that really helps to deliver.
Thank you. Thank you so much to the panel. It's been a fascinating session for me, and I hope everyone's enjoyed it.